Yo, what's good people, it's Cactus, and in today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to mix UK drill beats. So I'll be showing you how to turn this into this. This video has been requested many times, so I finally got around to doing it. I'll be showing you how to mix the melodies and the drums and pretty much anything that you need to know when it comes to mixing drill beats. So let's get into it. Alright, so there's a couple things that I want to tell you before we get into the mix. And the first one is, if you just pick good sounds to start off with, you're going to save yourself so much time. When you're making drill beats, all the sounds are usually electronic. People have already used compressors and EQs and everything else to get the sound sounding right before they sell the part. So if you start applying things like EQs and compressors just because you think you have to, you're just going to squash the sounds and make it even worse. If there isn't a problem, if you can't hear a problem, then chances are you don't need to do anything to it. You're going to see how simple my mixing techniques are. I will show you a couple other things that I might not always do just so you can learn them, but honestly, the only thing that I ever really do is maybe a couple EQs, classic clipper on the master, and then just leveling, volume and panning, but I'll explain everything. So usually I mix along the way. I don't want to have to make a full beat and then before I arrange it, I start mixing everything. It's just a waste of time. You can make certain decisions as you're making the beat, but for the sake of the tutorial, I haven't done anything whilst I'm making the beat, so all the levels reset, there's no EQs, no nothing. And the main thing to know about mixing is it's all about balance. So balancing volume and balancing the stereo field, and I'll show you what I mean by stereo field. So I've just pulled up Ozone 9 just so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. So this is the stereo field. You've got everything all the way to the left ear, everything all the way to the right ear, and then everything in the middle. So if I just play this full beat now unmixed, you can see there's things happening throughout the whole stereo field. There's a lot of energy in the middle. There's things going either side as well. So each instrument needs its own place. It needs its own place in volume and its own space in the stereo field. Otherwise, you might get phase issues, which basically means that it could cancel each other out. When you hear people talk about mono and stereo, stereo is when you've got the stereo field, so you can hear everything in the left and right ear. But if it's in mono, if I just drag this down, everything's going to be centered, so it's going to be in one speaker. So if you're listening in headphones, you'll just hear that everything's down the middle now. And then it opens it up when it's in stereo. It's just good to know that because some devices like phones and laptops have their speakers in mono, so there isn't two separate speakers, they've just got all the sound coming through one. And then headphones and other speakers which have a left and right side will play it in stereo. So sometimes it can be good to check your beats in mono before you export it, just to see how it might sound on other devices, but honestly I never do it. I think most people play music on something that has a stereo effect, so that's the main thing I worry about. Alright, so to start mixing it, I'm going to link everything to the mixer. So you can either click and drag down, or you could just double click and it highlights everything. And I like to name things before I link it so that the name copies across to the mixer, because if I just drag this to channel 4, you can see that it still shows as insert 4 and not kick. So name everything first, and what I also like to do is have the instruments at the top and then the drums at the bottom. So I'm just going to hold Alt and press up, and I like to set it like this. I have the kick, then the 808, and then the snares, then the hi-hats, and then the perks, and then any effects. You don't have to do it in that order, but it's just what I'm used to. And if you really want to, before you link it, you can change the color. So I'm just going to come up to this arrow, color selected, and then gradient, and then select 2 colors. Now it's colored everything. And then I'm going to come to insert 1, press Control and Shift and L. So that's why you need to name and color everything before you send it, otherwise it won't copy it across. And then at this point, you want to start leveling things out. And this is the most important part. Like I was saying earlier, it's all about balance. And I don't even balance everything in the mixer straight away. I like to do it in the channel rack, and I'll show you why. So when people go from the mixer, they tend to look at the dB level. So they'll look at all of these points and they think, right, the kick needs to be the loudest, then the 808. But you need to remember that dB isn't perceived loudness. So something can have a higher dB than something else, but still sound quieter. So let me just give you an example. Kick's hitting at -5.32. So I've just put on a clipper to give you the example. So it was hitting at -5.32. Now it's hitting just under it, but it's going to sound louder. So this is before and then after. See how that sounds louder, but it's not actually hitting anywhere above it. It's actually hitting around about the same or just below. So that's why you should try and go by your ears rather than looking at all of the levels. And before I do that, I'm just going to put the classic clipper on the master. I like to output at -0.1 and then I mix into the classic clipper. If you don't have this, you can use a soft clipper. They're pretty similar, but the classic clipper has an input gain. So if it's not quite loud enough, you can just bring the gain up. And I like using a clipper over a limiter because a limiter will basically, it's like a brick wall. It will squash down the transients. But if you use a clipper rather than squashing them down in a flat way, it kind of rounds off the curve. So I don't want to get too technical with it. It's basically a little bit of a different sound. I just prefer the sound of a clipper. All right, so I'm going to start balancing everything out. And just know that anything that you do in the channel rack, so volume, panning, if you open one up and then do some like EQs or effects or the boost, this is going to affect the instrument before it gets to the mixer. So it's like a signal flow. So everything starts here and then it gets sent up here with all your effects. So your effects work in a line as well. So if you've got EQ, then halftime, it's going to EQ the sound before halftime's applied. And then after all of the effects, this is the last point of volume. So if you had something like an 808 that was way too loud in the channel rack, it's going to be clipped before it even gets to the mixer channel. So any effects or EQs that you put on, you're going to be working with a sound that's already clipped. So even if you turn down the volume in the mixer after that, you're still going to have a clip sound because you've clipped it going into it. And clipping isn't always bad. I purposely click some sounds like kicks in even 808 sometimes, but I'll explain that soon. All right, so I'm just going to start balancing the volume out. I'm just going to do a couple more tweaks in the mixer. Alright, so the levels are pretty much set. And once I start adding effects, I might have to adjust them again, which is why, again, I usually just mix as I go when I'm making beat. And with panning, like I was saying earlier, it's all about balance. So I'll show you what I mean. Usually mix with everything together, but I'm just going to solo the drums for now. You can see some of the drums are already panned. So if you're looking at this little signal here, the dB reading, you can see if it's higher at one side, that means it's panned to that side. So the open hat's already a tiny bit panned. So I've got a rim and a snare happening at the same time. So I could just pan one slightly to the left, one slightly to the right, but you don't really need to do that. With hi-hats, it's up to you if you want to keep them in the center or slightly panned. These are already slightly panned, so I'm going to leave them. So now I've got these perks. I've got this kind of counter snare, this open hat, and then these. I'm going to solo just these so you can hear them. So this snare, I'm going to pan this to the left, maybe around about 40%. This open hat to the right. This perk is already panned, so I can leave that. And then this perk here, what I want to do with this perk is that delay effect that you heard. I did that in the actual piano roll. So I'm going to come to the perk, press F7 to go to the piano roll, and I'm going to pan it from here, just so I can change each individual note. So the first one I'm going to keep centered. The second one, I'm going to pan to the bottom, which is left, top, which is right. Something similar here. So I've got two delays going on here. Alright, so I've got the volume and the panning balance. So now I'm going to start moving on to each individual instrument if I want to apply some creative effects or if there's any issues that I need to fix. Alright, so with the strings, I want to add some delay. I think I'm just going to keep it on quarter delay. Yeah, there we go. And a lot of the time when you're adding effects, most of these instruments and VSTs that you're using will already have effects on them. So for example, these strings already have a bit of reverb, so I could even just go back to the VST and add more reverb in that. Or turn off the reverb in the VST and then add my own. You don't really need to add in two of the same thing. Right, I'm going to focus on the instruments a little bit now. So I've got the piano, the strings, a second layer of strings, some vocals. And what you want to think about now is the frequency spectrum. And what I mean by that is, if I pull up an EQ, this is a frequency spectrum. So you've got the low end, the mids, and the high end. And when you're making a beat, all of the instruments that you add, you want them to have their own space in the frequency spectrum. So these strings right here, taking up the majority of the high end. And if I show you the piano is not really clashing with it. It's subtle just because I've lowered the volume. But it's taking up a lower end in the frequency spectrum. So that's what you need to think about when you're selecting sounds. You don't want things that are going to fight for each other's space. So this is the second strings. It's quite lower down just to add emphasis to the first strings. So these two aren't really clashing, but what I want to think about is how they sound with the 808s, because the 808 usually takes up the majority of the low end. So I'm just going to play them together. So to me, I can hear a little bit of mud, a little bit of distortion, and it's probably because I've got a piano that's taking up a little bit of the low end and then that second layer of strings. So what I'm actually going to do is group the instruments. I'm just going to right click on an empty channel and I'm just going to name this instrument bus. I'm holding Alt and the arrow key and I'm just bringing this in front of the instruments. And I'm going to work on the vocals separately. So I'm just going to send the strings and the pianos to this bus. So all I'm doing is holding Control, clicking and dragging over them. And then I'm going to right click down here on the instrument bus and then route to this track only. Now when I add an EQ to the instrument bus, it's going to affect everything. So I don't need to add one on each channel. This will also save you some problems as well, which I won't go too in depth about. So to save room for the 808, I'm going to add a high pass or low cut, same thing. So I'm just going to drag this top one down until it says high pass. And then I'm going to change the steepness with this one here. Now I can just drag the frequency up until it sounds clear. With the vocals, I actually want to filter the vocals out. So I'm going to add a high pass and a low pass. I just like the effect when vocals are filtered. But I want to test it in the mix. I also want to push the vocals into the background, so I'm going to do that with some reverb. You can use the standard reverb, but I like the Valhalla one. So the mix level is what you want to look at. If it's set to 100%, then that's the furthest into the background it's going to go. But if you dial it back, you're going to get most of the dry signal and then just the reverb as well. So this, for example, is 10.4% reverb, and then the rest of the signal is the dry signal. The more mix level, the further to the background it goes. I want to test it in the mix. Quite a lot. And I'm actually going to bring the EQ below the reverb. When you add in reverb, you get a lot of low end build up, and then the EQ is filtering out the vocals and the reverb. And the last thing I want to do with the instruments is, you'll see that these strings are panned slightly to the left. So the piano, I'm going to put that slightly to the right, just to balance it out. And then I can leave this bottom layer of strings in the middle. Vocals, I like to sit in the middle as well, because they're in the background. Alright, so the next part, the kick and the 808, which everyone wants to know about. So let's just play them together. So when it comes to the kick and the 808, the most important part is just picking sounds that sound good together. And that's just going to solve all your problems. 90% of the time, I don't put anything on the kick or the 808. I just pick sounds that work well together and then just adjust the levels, and that's it. People watch tutorials and see producers adding things like sidechain compression or EQs to the kick and the 808, and they think that they have to do that in every single beat. But a lot of the times, you're trying to fix a problem that isn't there, so you just make it worse than what it was before. So I'm just going to listen to this and see how they sound together. So the 808 by itself is quite a distorted 808. So it's not the kick that's causing that distortion, it's just the sound that I liked. And then if I listen to the kick by itself, I can hear that some of the kick's energy gets taken away when it's joined with the 808. And it could be because we need to flip the phase. So flipping the phase basically means that I'm going to turn this waveform upside down, and I just use the reverse polarity button. So when you get a lot of frequencies that are similar, that's when you can get phase cancellation, which is what I mentioned earlier about things cancelling each other out. So I've just flipped the phase of this kick. See how that's brought back some energy? That's with it off. You might need to listen in headphones. And that's on. So sometimes all you need to do is check the phase and make sure that the kick and 808 are actually working well together. That doesn't always happen, but it was a good example, so it might just be worth checking every time. And now what I see a lot of producers do is add an EQ to the kick and the 808, and they'll take out everything below like 20 to 30 hertz. And sometimes it works, sometimes it will get it sounding cleaner. But let me just show you. So that's the EQ on the kick. If we take the EQ off, hitting much harder with the EQ off. So that's why I'm saying don't just add things because you've seen it in the video and you think that you have to do it. So let me just check on the 808 as well. So same thing again, I'm rolling off a little bit below 30. That's without. I think it hits harder without the EQ. And you also have to think about which notes you're playing as well, because if I press A, you can see it's hitting up here. If I press D, it's hitting further down. But because I've got this EQ rolling off, it's going to roll off a chunk of that energy. So let me take it off. So only add an EQ if you really need to. If the kick and 8 aren't really working well together, then what I'd recommend maybe trying first is finding out where the kick's hitting. So it's this point here where it's got the peak, around about 60 hertz. So go to the EQ on the 808 around about 60 hertz, and then just make a slight dip, tighten the bandwidth a bit, literally just a couple dB. It'll be subtle, but sometimes it can make a difference. Or the other option is to use sidechain compression, but rather than sidechaining it and then adding a limiter and taking away a big chunk of the 808, you can do it with the EQ. So on the kick, I'm going to add Fruity Peak Controller, and I'm going to bring the volume down. Make sure that mute is unchecked as well. It's not the volume of the actual kick, it's just the peak controller amount. And then you want to see where the kick's hitting. It's going to be the peak, which is around about 60 hertz. You can see that number there. So on the 808, you're going to bring the second point to that same spot around about 60 hertz. And then right click here, because this is what's going to make it go up and down. Select link to controller. Here, select peak control peak. Select inverted here, and then change this 1 to 0.5. Now every time the kick hits, the 808 is going to duck just in that frequency range. So maybe tighten up the bandwidth. You only want a couple dB. So look, if the volume's all the way up, it's going to bring the 808 all the way down. So around about there is fine. The other way to do it is with the limiter. If you want to do it that way, then click on the kick, right click on the 808 and click sidechain to this track, add a fruity limiter, and then go to the compressor, right click sidechain, select the kick, and then you want to bring down the threshold. The ratio is how much compression is going to happen. The release time is how long it's going to take for it to go back to its normal level. And the attack is how quickly it's going to kick in. So you might like the sound of that, but to me, it takes out too much of the 808. So I'd just rather do it with the EQ, or just pick samples that work well together and not use anything. I'll show you them both. So this is with the limiter. Then with the EQ. See, to me, the 808's hitting harder when I just use the EQ rather than the limiter. The last thing that I want to do is add an EQ to this impact, just because I know there's a lot of low energy buildup, which might sound muddy when it's played with everything else. So around 80 hertz is fine. And I want to make one more creative decision. So I'm going to add a frequency splitter to the 808, and I'm going to sidechain this to an empty track. So insert 17. I'll just bring this one back to the 808 so it's clear. I'll rename it 808 high. Now in the frequency splitter, I'm going to right click on the mids, select 808 high, and then same with the highs, I'll select 808 high. That's just the second channel. But now I need to mute the mids and the highs here, otherwise it'll be doubled up. So now I'm going to make the low end slightly more mono. A lot of people say that your 808s and kicks and everything need to be in mono, but really there's no rules, just experiment with things. But sometimes if you're adding stereo shapers to your 808 and the low end is too wide, it can get a bit muddy and can sound a bit weird. So that's why I like to add a stereo splitter and then keep the low end a little bit more mono than the high end. So look, I'm not dragging it up all the way, and I know this 808 that I'm using was already in stereo. So now the low end's a bit tighter, a bit cleaner, but the high end I'm just gonna leave. Alright, so I finished mixing it. The only thing that I need to do now is arrange it, and then I'll quickly show you the outcome. Alright, so in the beginning, I just left the piano, vocals, and I added a synth bass. All I did was level in with the synth bass as well.
Cactus.
So I'm just starting with the hats and the perks. Kicks and the snares. And the counter melody. melody of the piano. And I'm just giving people a little teaser of the strings before the hook. Different 808 pattern. And then the synth bass comes back in. So this is basically the bridge before the hook. And now the strings come in properly. And then the vocals again for the second part of the hook. And then the same again. There's a few adjustments in the second verse, nothing too major though. So I hope you liked the video and I hope you're feeling the beat. Hopefully you took some gems from this one as well and I've made it a little bit easier for you to understand. I just wanted to show you how simple it can be because I think a lot of people overthink mixing. But hopefully you got some gems from the video, and if you did, don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel. I drop new tutorials every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 PM GMT. And I'm also dropping new podcast episodes on a regular basis on my other channel, which is Cactus Convos. But thank you for watching and I'll see you next time.
Cactus.